And this is a complete fulfillment of the words of
Yes,
Hazrat Khalifatul Masih,
yes.
and the kind of advice that he gave to you. That's incredibly inspiring.
Yeah. So that's my long story, but I think it shaped everything that I am now. And God willing, if I stay connected with this advice, I'm very confident by God's grace that it will be blessed because I took that leap of faith. It's not really a leap of faith, it's just a feeling you have that the person giving you the advice is a man of God and acting on it. But it was a very uncertain time for me. And so, Alhamdulillah, by God's grace, I'm here now.
Welcome to another episode of the Al Hakam Inspire podcast. Our guest today is Amjad Khan, who is partner and chair of Brown Neri Smith Khan Law. He's also an adjunct professor at UCLA Law and co founder of Global Lawyers for Refugees, which is an innovative collaboration of lawyers from leading international law firms and works by empowering refugees through state of the art legal advocacy. He's also the National Secretary of Public Affairs of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA and has provided a written testimony on the subject of discrimination and persecution against Muslims worldwide. Amjad Khan, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to the Al Hakam Inspire podcast.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us today. I just want to dive straight in. There's one thing which stands out to me is the fact that you're a practicing lawyer, a very successful one that is, and you also teach law at UCLA. But alongside all of this, of course, they're very time-consuming. It's a very time-consuming occupation. Alongside all of this, you also dedicate a lot of your time to services for the Jamaat, for Islam. So I just wanted to ask you that your passion for law and practicing law and teaching it, has Islam played a role in this? And if so, how has it?
Well, I very much appreciate the generous introduction and everything that you mentioned. To answer your question directly, I would not even be in the position I am but for my faith. Islam guides me in my daily practice. Everything about me, everything I do, every person I serve, every client I advocate for, I do so because my faith commands it of me. And it's not just something I'm saying, it's something that I feel imbibed in my heart, in my very being, the very fiber of who I am. And that's why my faith, Islam, I think is so beautiful because it propels me to have a purpose in life. There are so many different paths that people can take professionally. In my mind, there's no such thing as a part-time Muslim. I'm a full-time Muslim. I'm a full-time Ahmadi Muslim in everything I do. And that's the philosophy by which I live my life. Whether it's off camera, speaking privately to clients, or on camera now, I strive to abide by the tenets of Islam. And there's one particular verse of the Quran, I think, if you're going to ask a particular tenet that inspires me, there's one verse of the Quran, which of course all of us know, but it's a verse of the Quran that has a lot of meaning for me as I move into my 20th year of legal practice. And that's the verse in Surah Al-Nisa that talks about justice, right? And this is the seminal verse. There's so many verses that talk about justice, but particularly it says, "O ye who believe, be strict in observing justice and be witnesses for Allah, even though it be against yourself or against parents and kindred. Whether he be rich or poor, Allah is more regardful of them both than you are. Therefore, follow not low desires so that you may be able to act equitably." So this standard of justice in Islam is so deep and unique that when I first understood this idea of the path to becoming a lawyer, and that was not my path, by the way. When I was a young kid, I was interested to become an English professor. I studied,
Wow.
novels in college, and I was really interested in writing, and I really didn't have law on my radar, although I knew that that could be a potential path. But when I saw the world around me and I saw all of the injustices that you observe as a young teenager and then going into college, the verses that you read or memorize when you're younger have new meaning. And this particular aspect of this verse where it says, be always just, even it be against yourself or your parents or your loved ones, really shook me. Because to me, that meant a different type of justice. It meant a justice that is paramount to any relationship you have in the world. And that idea of absolute justice,
Mm.
which is so sublime in Islam, is what I think captivated me. It gave me what I would say is like that seed of inspiration that can kind of grow and blossom and sprout. And it's always stuck with me. And now when I represent clients, and they could be large corporations, they can be executives at corporations, they can be you know, all sorts of companies or individuals of any kind. They can also be pro bono representing refugees, as I do. I always think about this, that am I acting in a manner where I'm placing the concept of justice ahead of my relationships or my personal interest? It's not about me. It's about God's justice in this world. And that's basically it. That's what, to answer your question directly, that's what guides me from the precepts of Islam and the Quran.
I think that's incredibly inspiring, and something that all of us should kind of aspire towards, having that kind of pure intention and motivation that you've talked about. So you mentioned that you're an Ahmadi Muslim, and prior to the podcast, we were discussing there was a particular kind of instruction or incident that happened in 2015, where you had an interaction with Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, the fifth caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and the leader of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community worldwide. Tell us a bit about that, and how what was that interaction and all that instruction that you received, and how has that shaped your career and impacted your life today?
Yes, I mean, it was life-changing advice. And I will say here for the listeners' benefit that I belong to a community that is organized around a single spiritual leader. His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad is the fifth successor to the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, the promised Messiah, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And this community that I was born into is a beautiful community. And it's one that has this leadership structure that really guides all Ahmadi Muslims, millions worldwide. So I'm just one of millions who follow and abide by the teachings and guidance of my faith, but particularly the leadership that His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad offers. And so when I was younger, growing up, my father, who was a very active member of the community, he would always tell me that in whatever you're doing, whether it's buying a new toy that you want — I was really into Nintendo growing up in the 80s as a kid. I was just a video game maven. Whether it's buying that new Nintendo, or I got my first pair of Nikes when I was, I think, in sixth grade, and that was a big deal back then in the
Yeah.
80s. He would say, pray for that, and not just pray to God, but also write to your Khalifa, write to His Holiness. At the time, it was the fourth successor of the promised Messiah of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And so I would write these letters to Hazur, to His Holiness, for prayers and guidance. And there would be such trivial requests. I think back on them, and I would be
Yeah.
asking for that new game that I wanted or that new toy. But it really didn't matter to my father and my mother what particular thing that you needed to ask of the Khalifa. The point was to ask a man of God for prayers. And that, of course, is not for everyone, but it was certainly something for me that I remembered. It's something that I could seek guidance for. And then, of course, when I would meet Hazur in these various, trips and travels, we lived all the way here in Los Angeles. So
Yeah.
it was very difficult to travel to London where he lived, but he visited Los Angeles a few times when I was younger. And so those meetings were incredibly impactful. And I remember, writing to him about things and aspirations. And I remember even writing to him that maybe one day I could even be a judge. I remember writing that. And I would always get this loving advice back from Hazur at the time. And that advice would always be full of prayers and full of purpose. And so that I mentioned that as the root, my root relationship was really much bound in this fabric of Khilafat, which is the leadership of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And
Yeah.
as that relationship became stronger, I was in law school right after 9/11, actually.
Hmm.
And it was actually an incredible time. It was my first week of law school at Harvard. And that was when the class was interrupted and the planes hit the two towers. And in fact, the flight that was hijacked was the flight from Boston Logan Airport to LAX. It's a United airliner, one of the flights. That was the
Oh
same
wow.
flight. That was the same flight my parents took back, the same flight number to drop me off 1 week earlier.
Wow.
So my parents took the very route, and if they were just a week later, they would have been on the planes. So it's a very dramatic moment, and I'll never forget it. The Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, who is a Supreme Court Justice in the United States, she was my professor back then. This was over 20 years ago, and it was really, I remember her interrupting the class and telling us what's happening, and I remember how difficult it was as an American Muslim lawyer to be at Harvard at that time and dealing with the discrimination and the Islamophobia that came from that. So that was the time when I was in law school, and I was going through law school, and then in 2003, the fourth successor of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Tahir Ahmad, passed away. And for me, as at that time, I was quite young, at 24, 25, and the relationship I had with my Khalifa was very strong. So it felt extremely painful to lose someone that I had loved so much after my parents. That was a relationship, even probably more so than my parents at that point of my life. And so I remember crying in those days, and I was about to take a final exam the next day,
Mm.
the next day
Wow.
after he passed away. And so I went to the dean, which was this Justice Kagan. She happened to be the dean of Harvard Law School in that year. And I said to her that, look, the someone I really deeply love has passed away, and I need to go to London to attend his funeral. And she started asking me questions, and then we had a conversation, and then she gave me that permission, God bless her, to leave and miss the final exam. And I said I would
Wow.
book it a week later, and I got permission, and then I traveled to London, and there I experienced something that perhaps some people hadn't experienced at the time, certainly someone of my age, which is the election of a Khalifa. And that is when I first was able to say prayers behind the present Khalifa, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad. I'm saying all of these details to kind of set the stage for what he told me in 2015 that changed my life.
Yeah.
And so when I met him, um, I just did a handshake with him, and he was looking down at the time, and he was elected to be the leader of the faithful. I mean, this is a major undertaking, a grand undertaking, and an incredibly humble person. I didn't know him at that time, but I remember this incredible sense of humility in his eyes, and the weight of that burden in his eyes. And I just shook the hand, and then I moved on. It was like 3 seconds, but there was electricity there that I sort of can't capture in words, but it was just a moment for me where I felt like, okay, there's now a change of leadership. This is a seminal moment in history. And I was a law student. And then I remember flying back after that and taking that final exam, and feeling that relationship starting now over 20 years ago. From that point on until now, I have been blessed to have a relationship, like so many people, with Hazur. We call him Hazur, a dear one. So I'll use that phrase, Hazur. And he also did my nikah, my marriage ceremony in 2005, right after I graduated from law school as well in Canada. July 4th, actually July 4th, 2004 was that marriage ceremony. I'll never forget that. That was right after I graduated from law school. And so I've had this relationship with him since then. And so for everything, I seek guidance, spiritual guidance. And one such quandary that was happening to me was, like a lot of lawyers who start at a law firm, and I worked at a very large law firm, you go through what they call the rat race, this race of trying to make partner. And it's an incredibly difficult task, and it requires enormous amount of hours. So
Hmm.
I had gone through that process, and sometimes it can take 8 years, 9 years, 12 years. There's no real set path, but it's somewhere in that range. It's usually a decade of your life devoted to this task. And so I did that path. I mean, I worked my first years 41 out of 52 weekends. You know,
Wow.
I was billing, 23, 2,500, 2,700 hours a year,
Yeah.
just doing so much work. And you start off with a lot of the work on me. And so I did that for large law firms, and I was going through that process. And there's an ebb and flow with that. And as a young Muslim lawyer, I was the only one in my entire law firm who was Muslim. So there was a challenge of that. So as I was going through those ranks, I worked for 7 years at a very large law firm, and then I got a position at another firm that recruited me, and I was at this firm, and they elevated me to the position right before counsel with a path towards partnership. So I was going through this, and by that point in time, I put in 10 years of my life. From 2005 until 2015, 10 years of my life in this range of work. And I was doing a lot of extracurricular, including serving the community and others during this process. And I would always write to Hazur for prayers. As I was going through this process and I was up to make partner, it was November of 2014. And it so happened that the months of September and October of 2014, there was a very distinguished, incredible jurist from Pakistan named Mujibur Rahman, advocate.
Hmm.
He's a quite a luminary, considered by many to be the Thurgood Marshall, which he's a famous Supreme Court justice in America, but the Thurgood Marshall of Pakistan. I mean, he was a hero for many because he fought for human rights and civil rights in Pakistan. And I decided to host him in various law schools in America. He did a U.S. tour, his first American tour, and he lectured at Harvard. I hosted him at Harvard and Columbia and many other law schools. He was at Princeton for a bit, and I had this tour where he was speaking, like a speaking circuit. So I had the pleasure of hosting him, and it so happened he happened to be there. And as he was there, I got to be very inspired by his work, and I was about on the verge of making partner in all of this. And he told me something in my various journeys with him as I was driving 5 hours from Maryland to Boston, and I showed him my school and everything. And he was telling me about human rights, and he knew I was a corporate lawyer, and he knew about and he knew I had a passion in writing, and he said perhaps you should think about teaching, and all of these things he was giving me nasihat, as they say, or advice. And so I
Yeah.
had a pleasure. It was just a true immense pleasure working with Mujibur Rahman Sahib. May God rest his soul. An amazing person. And it so happened that my wife was due with our daughter, and on November 3rd, she was born. And it happened to be that a few days before she was born, Mujibur Rahman Sahib, who was hosted by his son had a heart attack. And his son had a heart attack. Mujibur Rahman Sahib at this point was almost 80 years of age. His son brought him, who was, in his mid 50s. But he had, unfortunately, a heart attack as he was in our home.
Right.
And so that was a very unfortunate incident. And so, but the result of it, he was fine. He was getting care in our hospital here in Los Angeles. His father could not travel back alone
Mhm.
to Pakistan. At the same time, my daughter was due, and so my daughter was born. And while he was there, and he was waiting at my parents' home for a few weeks, at least, maybe even a month and a half or so, 6 weeks, while his son was recovering from heart surgery. But he needed to get back. He himself was not in good health. And so at that point in time, it occurred to me, and I felt like it was my duty to uh, take him to London.
Right.
His
Right.
son was in London, and I thought I would fly with him. And this was just a few days after my daughter was born. So my wife very lovingly and patiently told me that I can do this. So I did. And so I flew with him together in the first week of November of 2014. And as I was flying with him, my task was just to drop him off and make sure he was taken care of, and I would fly back. And of course, whenever I traveled to London, I would visit with Hazur, and I would tell him about this tour and this trip and so forth.
Yeah.
At the same time I was doing this, I was working at this law firm. I had been told for a few years that, you have to keep doing, these tasks and you'll be closer to partner. And they were giving me all of these assurances. You may have to go to Washington, D.C., work with this group and that group. It's kind of the usual process where we all love you, but you got to keep doing this and this commercially in order to get there. So I was going through that sort of process. And as I got there, I met with Mujibur Rahman and myself. We both had this incredible visit with Hazur that went well, and I told Hazur why I was there. And then I had a private meeting with Hazur that evening. In that meeting, I walked in with the intent of asking Hazur's prayers. I had written a letter that I should be made partner at the law firm. And so when I walked in, and now we're getting to the crux of the matter, but I think this is the rising action for the climax.
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure you had all of the information. So as I got to that meeting and I met with Hazur, my intention was to ask prayers to make partner. I also was going to ask Hazur prayers that I may, consider and pursue my academic writing and my academic interest as well. So I went inside the meeting, and Hazur mentioned to me and said, His Holiness mentioned to me that you've sent me a letter for prayers, and I've read that letter. And he said, and I'm now paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact words, but he said something to the effect of, um, for how long are you going to be playing this game, of making partner?
Hmm.
And I said, Hazur, I didn't. He said, well, this. It seems like I receive a lot of letters from you for prayers, and you're going through this process. But I'm asking you, for how long are you going to make going through with this race to make partner? Um, have you thought, or have you considered for a moment that you could be a professor,
Wow,
a
that's
law
amazing.
professor? And
Yeah.
I said, Hazur, I hadn't really thought of that. I've spent 10 years of my life doing corporate work. And he said, no, I know, but have you thought about being a professor? And I said, Hazur, I suppose that thought has crossed my mind, but I know it takes a lot of work to get there. And he said, you've written a number of scholarly articles, correct? I said, yes. And he said, if you think of your family background, and then he started talking about my grandfather, who was a missionary or an imam of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and my great grandparents as well. And my great grand uncles were not members of the community, but they were part of a political family. They were the Ali brothers, famously in Pakistan, who helped sort of found this India movement, Khilafat movement, and then in independence that led to Pakistan's independence. They're very famous. And the elder of those three brothers, the Ali brothers, was a member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, my great grandfather. And he said
Wow.
it's sort of in your DNA that there's this sense of sort of scholarship and reflection and writing that's apparent in your, I guess, virasat, your heritage. And that's something that you should keep in mind. And he also said that you just finished a tour with a leading advocate, and you went through all these academic universities, and you got to observe firsthand the power of a voice in an academic setting, and you enjoyed it. You just told me this morning that you enjoyed it, that trip
Yeah.
with Mujibur Rahman advocate. So have you thought of this? And you should certainly pursue becoming a professor. And I said, Hazur, I hadn't thought of it, and this idea of making partner in a law firm. And he said, the idea of your practice will not go away, but why do you have to do it working for someone? He said, have you ever thought for a moment that you can still be a partner and then you can be a professor? And he said
Wow.
it in those terms, a partner and a professor. And I said, Hazur, at the same time. He said, at the same time. And I said,
Wow.
Hazur, I had never thought of that. And in fact, I don't know anyone I know who is a partner and a professor. I said, you're either a law partner because you made law partner in corporate, or you're a professor.
Yeah.
But you kind of don't choose those two worlds because it just doesn't seem like they seem like almost two different lives. And Hazur said, the idea of making partner and professor is something that you could pursue, but you should pursue it on your own terms. And I said, Hazur, that would mean leaving the law firm that I'm in? He said, yes, that would mean leaving the law firm that you're in. And I was on the verge of making partner in a matter of months, maybe it was a year, but there was a path there, right, for me to take it.
Yeah.
And if you're to give your listeners an idea of making law partner, it's you go from a financial standpoint, you go from making a very good salary to a phenomenal salary. It's usually a 10x increase in your money.
Mm.
You could very easily clear millions of dollars of money, and this is something that you work for. And so the Hazur gave me this advice, and his advice was effectively to just stop everything I'm doing and find a way to become a professor and partner on my own terms. And I had nothing in my hand at the time for that path. And he said, this should be this is the guidance I'm giving you. And he also said something as well that was very moving for me personally. And he said that you might be wondering how well you will do financially,
Mm.
how well you might do, how might you obtain the financial advantage that you were going to obtain as partner. And he said, just remember with this advice that will never be a worry for you.
Wow.
That if you follow this advice, you will not feel the burden of that in your life. And this is the advice I'm giving you. And I remember just feeling overwhelmed with this advice. Like it almost felt like someone was lifting a weight on my shoulders and propelling me on a path. And literally, as I was embracing Hazur, I felt like he was giving me a gentle push to the world. And in my life, that became the seminal moment. I'll never forget it. It was November of 2014. And I remember walking out of that mulaqat, that meeting with Hazur, shaking to such an extent that I think one of the people noticed and saying that it seems you've had a very impactful meeting with Hazur. And I said, I did. And I was just sitting reflecting on this. And then I called my wife and explained to her, right, much to her shock, that I was going to leave this job. And I don't know, I didn't have anything.
Yeah.
And this is where you have to have a faith. And I didn't have any other job lined up. I didn't understand what to do, where to go, how to be a partner and professor, how to become a professor. So I told my wife this, and she was understandably very taken by this and saying, well, you've worked your whole life for this, but and I said, this is the advice that was given to me. She said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know what I'm going to do, but tomorrow I'm going to give my notice that I'm leaving my job. And and then at that point, we'll see what they did. So I walked into the law firm the very next week, and I called the partner, one of the managing partners, and I said, I would like to give my notice for 90 days that you give a 90-day notice that I'll be leaving the firm. And he instead of emailing, he just comes to my office and says, what is going on? And I said, well, I've decided to leave. He's like, are you leaving? Oh, so you got another offer to make partner at another law firm. Can we talk? Can we, I said, no, I have no other offer. And they said, well, so you're thinking of, are you thinking of, applying for other law firm jobs? And I said, no, I'm not. They said, well, why are you leaving? And I said, because I've been given this advice by my spiritual leader. Yeah. And they said, your spiritual leader? And I said, yeah, my spiritual leader. I had a visit with him and I asked him for prayers, and he told me that I should leave this firm. And he said, but you've spent all these years and you're on the verge of making partner and you understand the financial implications. And I said, I understand all of that, but I have no idea what I'm going to do next, nor do I even know that I'll ever work at a law firm. And they said, well, what was the advice? And I said, well, the advice was be a professor and a partner. And he said, well, how are you going to do that? And I said, well, he said, do you have an academic job? I said, I have nothing. So they said, okay. And I said, but I know I'm going to give you this notice. So after that was done, I came home and I told my wife I gave my notice. And then she said to me, she said, okay, what are you going to do now? And I said, well, I'm going to go to the local coffee shop every day and I'm going to start writing articles.
Wow.
Because my Khalifa has told me that I can be a professor. He told me that I'll be a professor. But I need to, in order to become a professor, you need to have scholarship. So I'm going
Yeah.
to start writing. So for the next 7 weeks, every day from 7:30 a.m. to 6 p.m., I went to the local, I think it was a Starbucks, and then there was another coffee shop. And every day I would take my laptop and I would just start writing an article about
Wow.
international law or human rights. And I started writing and writing and writing and writing. When I wrote my first piece, I wrote an article that was about 5,000 words and it was fully fleshed out. And as I finished it, I then looked at it and I sent it out for public. I sent it to a bunch of people. I had no academic experience. I'm a corporate lawyer. I have
Right.
no experience in comparative constitutional law, human
Right.
rights, or anything of the sort. And I decide to, send this out for publication. And within 4 days, I get a response from the Harvard International Law Journal, which is the most prestigious international law journal in the world, one of the few. And they said they would like to publish the piece.
Wow.
That's
And the
amazing.
piece, which we'll talk about maybe later, is about Pakistan's blasphemy laws. The title was How Blasphemy Laws Engender Terrorism. And so I was making this correlation argument that blasphemy laws and the proliferation actually correlate to a rise in terrorism. And so I
Yeah.
gave this new thesis that I presented in 2015. That was 7 weeks in Starbucks, that article. And when and it got published, and right when I sent it, I had this feeling that something's going to happen. And I didn't know
Yeah.
what, but I knew when I got that email back that it was being accepted for publication. I wrote to Azur and I said, this article has been printed for publication. Please pray. The next week, the very article I wrote, I got an invitation to write a essay for Foreign Affairs, the most
Wow.
prestigious journal in the world for foreign affairs, right? It's everyone reads it. It's really hard to get there. And at that time, there was the attack on the school children in Peshawar. 132 school children were massacred. It was the largest terrorist attack in Pakistan history. So they said, we understand that you've written a piece on blasphemy laws in Pakistan. We want you to write this piece. So I wrote a
Yeah.
commissioned piece, and they actually pay for that piece. So a
Wow.
commissioned piece that I wrote for about a week, and I sent that out. It's called Pakistan's Dark Days, and you can look it up. And it's a piece that was written right around the same time frame. So
Wow.
that was the second hit that I had. Then after that, I received an email from a colleague of mine that I went to law school with, who was working as a partner at a law firm. And he said to me, he said, there's a position that they've asked me to teach contract law at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, a very prestigious law school here in Los Angeles, top 10 law school, top 15 law school in the country. And they asked me to teach contract law, and I can't do it. And I thought of you. We both took contract law together, 15 years earlier. And he's like, I thought of you. Would you be interested to apply for a position as an adjunct faculty at UCLA?
Wow.
And I said to him, I said, and Jonathan is a good friend of mine. I said, I think my relationship with my Khalifa. He told me to become a professor, and I've given my notice to leave the law firm I'm at. And he didn't know any of that. And he said,
Wow.
well, this seems to be a blessed situation. They're interviewing a bunch of people. So can you go tomorrow for this interview? Tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I go to UCLA, and there's a position to teach contract law, and I have no idea how to teach contract law. I've never taught anything. And they asked me during the interview, they asked me, how would you go about teaching it? So I just came up with a design, and I just presented the pitch for this. And I gave all the details, and within a few days, they came back and said, we really enjoyed the interview. We would like to hire you for this position to join our faculty at UCLA as a lecturer. And by the way, the first class is starting in January, and there's 120 students that you will be teaching.
Wow.
And by the way, I had already given my notice, right? So I accepted this position. And within 2 months of Hazur's advice, I now had 2 academic publications and a position at a top 15 law school.
Wow. That is incredibly inspiring. And I just want to kind of get this right. So fast forward to today, you're now an adjunct professor and practicing corporate law,
Yes.
a partner and chair at your own firm
Yes.
as well.
Yes, I am. And that last part of that story, because the listeners might be wondering, well, how did the partner part
Yeah, yeah,
come to
yeah.
bear? Because they know the professor part happened. So, I got the third thing, by the way, that happened academically is that I was invited to give a lecture and a paper in Germany in June of 2015 at an international comparative law conference, which would be my third paper.
Right.
And the week of the conference was the week of the Germany annual convention, Jalsa Salana, in which Hazur would be visiting.
Oh,
And the
wow.
conference would be completed the day before Jummah, which
Wow.
was incredible. So I accepted this offer to give a keynote paper literally days before which I would be meeting Hazur. And
Yeah.
so I accepted that as well. So that was the third thing academically. Then I was just, there was the issue of making money because I had no money. I was going
Yeah.
to be leaving my job in February. It was 4 weeks left. I had to leave my job. I was going to have no paycheck. Academic work pays very little.
Yeah.
I mean, completely different lifestyle, right? I have a mortgage.
Yeah.
I have a young daughter who is barely less than 3 months old. I had my son as well. So we were a young family. And so my wife said, well, what are you going to do next to actually have a job that pays
Yeah.
the bills? And I said, I don't know, but I know Hazur said that I could be a partner. So then I said, I don't know what that means. So I was looking around and thinking about, okay, is there a place where I can maybe work, or how does this work? Do I freelance? I had no idea. And it so happened a few weeks later, I received an email from a partner who I worked with at the law firm way back in 2005, the first partner I ever worked with, a man named Ethan Brown, who is my partner now. And he asked me, he said, I was working at the large law firm and I've left it and I've started my own practice. Would you be interested? And he didn't know anything about my story. He didn't even know I gave notice to the firm. He said, would you be interested to join my firm? And he said, there's two other former colleagues of yours and we want to start a firm. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, what is it going to be? He said, well, it's just your own practice, your own clients, and you're only going to get paid for whatever you bring in. And I said, well, I have 10 years of experience. He said, I was very nervous about it. So I then had 3 or 4 calls and interviews with him and then invited him to my home. He gave me the pitch. And then I decided to accept that job. And he said, we're going to make you a founding partner of this firm.
Wow.
And I said, well, I've given my notice for February. He said, great, you'll start in end of March. And you're the founding partner of this firm. And it'll be Brown, Neri, Smith, Khan. And you're a partner.
Wow.
And I said, this is not my doing, because my Khalifa said that I will be partner. And I just literally made partner. Then there's a question of where would I get clients? I mean, I had no clients. My clients were at the other firm.
Yeah.
So I remember what Hazur said, do not have to be worried about your financial situation. It turns out that 3 of the clients that I had from the prior firm, who I did a lot of the work on, when they found out that I had started my own firm, they called me to move their business to me. And for them, it was great because I would be much cheaper than the more expensive law firm.
Yeah.
And so I started and hit the ground running with 3 clients who were from the prior firm that I was leaving. And I had the adjunct position. And
Amazing.
that's the rest of the story. So from April 2015 until today, we're going on almost 9 to 10 years now. I built this firm as a professor, but I've kept my academic perch and I've done both. And that's the life that I live. And we're up to, mashallah, over 20 lawyers and 2
Wow.
offices at our law firm. And some 11 of those lawyers are from the big firm that I left.
Wow. And this is a complete fulfillment of the words of
Yes.
Hazur Khalifatul Masih,
Yes.
and the kind of advice that he gave to you. That's incredibly inspiring.
Yeah. So that's my long story, but I think it shaped everything that I am now. And God willing, if I stay connected with this advice, I'm very confident by God's grace that it will be blessed, because I took that leap of faith. It's not really a leap of faith. It's just a feeling you have that the person giving you the advice is a man of God and acting on it. But it was a very uncertain time for me. And so, alhamdulillah, by God's grace, I'm here now. So.
What I found really profound in that was your connection with Mujib Saab. He's
Yes.
done a lot of work on the persecution of Ahmadis in Pakistan. And
Yes.
you have as well. You've actually done a lot of research. You've written about this, the persecution that Ahmadi Muslims face in Pakistan and around the world for that matter. Now, the question that I have is that, living in the West, a lot of the youth and generally people, they find it quite hard to comprehend the persecution that Ahmadis actually face. So from a human rights perspective, you can just shed some light on this.
Yes. So, this issue is an issue that also was something that I had to learn as a younger person, being a member of this community. You take for granted, you said, okay, I'm a member of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. You kind of know what the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is. But when I first visited Pakistan when I was younger, my mother had an uncle who had been attacked for his faith, and he had a ring on. It's a ring that has, it's actually a verse of the Quran, but it's also a revelation that was given to the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. Alaysa Allahu bikafin abdahu. Is not God sufficient for your servant? This is a ring that even I have on now. A lot of Ahmadis wear as a blessed ring. It was a verse that was given to the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community when he lost his father, to show patience in the face of adversity. But it also ironically turns out to be an identifying mark for Ahmadis who are living in Pakistan, because a lot of the people who oppose the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, who don't believe we're Muslim, when they see that Arabic script on a ring, they view that as an offense, and they view that with insult, and they ultimately also cause violence to happen. One such uncle of mine was brutally attacked because he had this ring, and I learned of this when I was 10 years of age.
Wow.
When I was in Pakistan, my mother told me the story, and I just put it in the back of my mind that happened. When I got to of an age 16, 17 in high school, when I started to understand my identity, who I am and where I come from, this Southern California kid. I was taking American cereal with me to Pakistan. I really didn't know the language. My Urdu was really broken. I'm just not, like, I'm an American kid. I started understanding that there existed this issue in Pakistan where an entire community has been declared to be not Muslim by constitutional amendment, that the constitution of the country has codified, saying that this is a definition of who a Muslim is. And a Muslim is certainly not someone who is a member of this community. In other words, the law had defined the person's faith for them and their conviction. And that struck me as very unusual and odd, that someone can say that they're Muslim, but the law says it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. We decide whether you're Muslim or not. And if you say you are, then we will punish you. That's the essence of what we're talking about here in Roman that you've asked, is that question, right? Which is this discrimination that exists for this community in Pakistan. And as I started intently studying this, it was really in college when I started really understanding what this issue was. I wrote my senior thesis on this subject of Pakistan and extremism and identity and constitutionality. And so that's the issue that I started really intently studying. And what I learned from that is that Pakistan's criminal code actually enforces this constitutional amendment, meaning it gives teeth to punishing those who would pose or purport to be Muslim. And that punishment is codified in a 1984 amendment called Ordinance 20. It's two sections of a penal code, section 298 B and C, which are essentially, if you use opposed to be Muslim, you use Islamic epithets. Anyone who purports to use Islamic terminology like Assalamu alaikum, or use Arabic script, even in wedding invitation cards, and like just all sorts of these offenses, they could be punished for posing as a Muslim, and that's a 3-year jail offense for posing as a Muslim. Now the question becomes, and I wasn't a lawyer at the time when I was studying this, is who defines what is posing as a Muslim? I mean, it's a very vague standard. I mean, anyone can accuse someone of an insult and then say that, you've insulted my faith because you're saying you're a Muslim and therefore you've committed blasphemy. and that blasphemy should land you to jail. Well, the other statute, it's a 50-word penal code provision of Section 295C, says, and this applies not just to Ahmadis, there was those two that apply to Ahmadis specifically for posing as Muslim, but this one says, it's a 50-word statute, that anyone who insults the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or any of his companions, or purports to deny the unqualified finality of his prophethood, which is a very important concept in Islam, this idea of him being a last prophet, then you could be actually criminally prosecuted and sentenced to death. That there was a capital punishment that would attach for that crime. All of this happened in 1984, 85, and 86. So that was the landscape that existed because of this Islamization of the country, this extreme view by then President Ziaul Haq of Pakistan. So my parents grew up in this era. My father immigrated in 1970, just before the amendment, but they grew up in this era where there was antipathy towards Ahmadis, but they left in part to flee from the clutches of this militancy and the clutches of this mindset. And so those laws exist today. They have not gone away. The constitutional amendment still exists. The criminal apparatus, the blasphemy laws they call, do exist as well. And so that's actually one of the reasons I went to law school, is I felt when I was applying for law schools that I wanted to use a law degree as a weapon to fight religious repression. A weapon. A law degree is a weapon that you have to use wisely, wield wisely. And once used effectively, you stand up for people who don't have a voice. This is why I love this profession. This is why I love law, because it is that incredible power of this tool that you have at your disposal. You understand the vocabulary of what was done to a people. And this is not just the Ahmadi community, what was done to the Rohingya community, the Uyghur community, what's being done to the Palestinians in Gaza, what's being done to the Yazidis, what's being done to many people, in many oppressed minorities, is the weaponization of law. And this is what my academic research focuses on, the weaponization of law. And the weaponization of law, how do you fight a weapon? How do you fight someone who's using a certain weapon? If they're lining up armies, what do? You line up armies. If they're using the law to repress, we use the law to correct. And that is the job of a lawyer. It's true for private or public law. Whatever you do, you're using that tool to redress injustice. And remember what that verse that inspired me says, that you even act against your own self-interest, because the law should not lie. If it's really a true sense of justice, the law should be equally applied, due process of law, equal protection under the law, equal dignity, equal citizenship, equal rights. What is equality? Certainly not what the Constitution of Pakistan says. And so therefore, that issue that exists here, in summary, is today a group of hundreds of thousands of Ahmadis, used to be millions, have been, with a stroke of a pen, declared to be non-Muslim, have been legally prosecuted, have been jailed, have been killed for their beliefs, and continue to be killed for their beliefs. And they're denied basic rights, which include the right to franchise, the right to vote freely. In order for an Ahmadi to vote, we have to say that we disavow the founder of our community. We have to say that we're non-Muslim. Imagine if every Catholic or Mormon in America had to say they're not Christian in order to vote. In order to vote. This is the reality, the daily reality of an Ahmadi. We know elections are coming up in Pakistan. In order to vote, we must declare that we're not Muslim, which is such a core issue of conscience. No Ahmadi will do that. And we have a 99% literacy rate compared to the 50% national rate, educated, engaged citizenry, and we can't vote in our elections because we're the wrong kind of Muslim. And this is the reality that exists in Pakistan. So that's basically the overview of the situation.
I think it's really interesting you mentioned that those laws that individuals fled the country due to are still present today, and they haven't changed. There's kind of generated this society which is well aware of the injustices and also the kind of discrimination of Ahmadi Muslims and other minority religious communities in Pakistan. But and this law kind of envelops all of these communities together.
Yes.
But there has been very little legal action to change these laws or make any kind of amendments towards them. Particularly, I mean, mostly because of the fear against the kind of religious powers or religious communities that are strengthened there and the religious scholars that are there. And I think it's equally surprising for anybody who hears this for the first time that by law, your religion is being governed by law, which is incredibly unique and also very unjust as well.
That's a very astute point, Dr. Hisham, because what you're pointing out is the inability to correct a situation that's embedded in the psyche of a society. When a society has gotten to a point where they want to otherize another community, otherize, I mean, just make them completely strip them of their individual identity and dignity, that is an indication that you may have a potential genocide. It's actually one of the indications of a potential genocide in the future. What happens then is the law becomes the weapon to define your inner faith, which shouldn't be the case, and then you are suppressed and victimized. It's very ironic. It's actually one of the research items I'm covering now. Some people assume that human rights violations are, they arise on their own and there's sort of a standalone violation that a government oppresses a community. Yeah. But actually, if you really analyze it, a lot of the communities that are oppressed today were not oppressed in the past. And they actually enjoyed civil rights and positive rights before those rights were taken away from them. Think, for example, of the Rohingya community. Genocide has been committed against them in Myanmar, then Burma. And this was a Buddhist majority that included Rohingya members in their governance. They were in parliament. They occupied positions of authority. This was in the turn of the 1940s, 50s. And then over time, the majority understood that they needed to have a national law that would strip them of their identity. So they passed a series of measures to scale back and strip those civil rights. Those civil rights violations became a gateway for genocide. Mm-hmm. Just imagine that. They had rights, they were stripped away, and then the genocide took place. This is what's happening with the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. We enjoyed rights. We were not declared non-Muslim for 20 years, 22 years, 23 years. The founding of Pakistan was built on this idea of separating religion and state. There was a vision by then Muhammad Ali Jinnah to build a society that would have equal citizenship. And Ahmadi was a member of government, Foreign Minister of Pakistan, Sir Zafrullah Khan. There was a Hindu in the cabinet as well. And others, Christians, others enjoyed rights. As they moved along, those rights were then stripped away, taken away, identity was stripped away, and then the law became a weapon. So this is what you're saying, that when it's built into the machinery, how do you correct it? And the only way to correct it is to hold them accountable in an international forum. And this is what we do with respect to our advocacy on this issue. So that's essentially the gist of it.
Excellent. I think definitely it's a very interesting issue, and it's very complex as well, with a lot of historical background as well. I think we'll come on to kind of the human rights issue to do with Israel and Palestine in a moment, but I just wanted to take it back one step further to your experiences with Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Hazur Ayyadullah Ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz. There were two historic occasions or events in the US where Hazur visited the Capitol Hill in 2012, and also the inauguration of the Fateh Azim Mosque in Zion, which has an incredible history and background related to that, and that was in 2022. On both of these occasions, you had the opportunity to have significant interaction with Hazur Khalifatul Masih, the Caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And I suppose it will be really interesting for our listeners to know about some of this experience that you had and your interactions. And was there anything that stuck out for you, or was particularly inspiring for you when Hazur made those visits to the USA?
Yeah, no, so taking my hat off as a lawyer and law professor for a moment and just focusing on my volunteer work for the community, one of the assignments that has been given to me, really a privilege, is to serve as a secretary for public engagement, public affairs in America. And so I've been in that position for a number of years, and it's a huge responsibility. And one of the most incredible honors of my lifetime is to host His Holiness Hazur in America, and to allow his voice to be heard in American circles. And this is such an enormous task, one that I'm clearly not prepared for and very unworthy of, and it feels extremely burdensome. I mean, it's a lot of long nights staying up trying to figure out how to make these visits successful. One such occasion was in 2012 when a lot was going on at the time. There had been this terrible atrocity that had been committed against the Ahmadi Muslim community in 2010, and then this was the Lahore attack, which was 86 Ahmadis were massacred by the Taliban, the TTP in Pakistan. Terrible situation. I was actually there in Pakistan a month before those attacks. I visited the mosque in Lahore that was attacked 1 month earlier. My wife lost an uncle in those attacks. An incredible, harrowing situation. So there was a lot of repression of the community in Pakistan at the time, and America was also engaged in a lot of drone conflict. The President Obama was engaged in a lot of conflict. Secretary Clinton at the time was Secretary of State. There's a lot of chatter around what was happening. I wanted to make sure that Hazur had an opportunity. At the time, he was warning of catastrophic world war. He was warning of the injustices globally that existed. He gave a speech even reciting that verse that I mentioned earlier about how America is not acting other than its own self-interest and how it's leading the world to war. And I said, this message needs to be delivered in the halls of Congress. And so we began planning for an event on Capitol Hill where he would deliver a speech to as many members who can attend. And we are a small community and, with humble resources. But by God's grace and mercy, he delivered a lecture in June of 2012 called Just Relations Between Nations, where he spoke about all of these subjects to 30 members of U.S. Congress, which included the Democratic leaders, who's the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who was hosting Hazur for this, and many other dignitaries and luminaries attended this event at the Gold Room in Rayburn. And it was an incredible moment. It was a moment I'll never forget because the circumstances that led to us preparing for that event were we didn't control the outcome of that event. We didn't expect there to be the kind of reception that was gained by Hazur's presence. But in a transpartisan way, one senator said Hazur had brought the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate together. We should have him more often. Wow. Which was a rare moment of transpartisanship that existed, right? That shows his name was U.S. Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania. That I think encapsulates the immense magnitude and effect of Hazur's words, which were distinctly spiritual words that were given in a political seat of power. And so I'll never forget that and all of the planning that went to it. And I also will never forget that we had an opportunity for Hazur to meet the President of the United States, President Barack Obama, and the Secretary of State. And we facilitated that meeting with the President and had that confirmed. And yet when I gave that invitation to Hazur to consider, he respectfully declined to meet the President of the United States. I wanted to repeat that again, that Hazur respectfully declined to meet the President of the United States. You don't hear that very often.
Usually it's the other way around.
Correct. And I say that because that was one of the most incredible moments personally that I witnessed. And the reason that he gave to decline that is because his meeting the President at the time when there was so much volatility going on in South Asia and the region and worldwide would not be an appropriate meeting because
Many vulnerable members of our community were facing persecution because of the acts of Western countries, because of the acts of America, particularly Pakistan. And how would it be that he could meet the president in any fashion when there was these injustices being committed? As a matter of principle, to decline such a meeting respectfully, because it would not serve the interest of the followers of the Khalifa, of the members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. That was his decision, that he focused on the intrinsic protection of a vulnerable community more than any kind of photo op with the president of the United States. And instead chose to deliver a message in Congress which was pointed and directed to those very people in power, that they should correct their ways, course correct, or they will lead down a path of injustice that will be irreparable, that will lead to a world war. That was done in 2012. And look, 2023 here, as we sit here, finishing off this year, this terrible year, where there has been war, and wars have been raged, throughout the last several years. We saw what's happening in Yemen and the injustices there, the millions of children who are starving, and all of the atrocities committed there. We saw what happened, of course, in Syria, in Iraq, in various parts of the world, in Libya, and all of the world crises. And of course, the present one, which we're going to talk about shortly, I'm sure, which has engulfed the world into a potential world war. And these things haven't been heeded that were said over a decade ago. So that's what I remember about hosting Hazur in Capitol Hill. And then just briefly on Zion, it's a small town, small city in Northwest, I think, Illinois, the outskirts of Chicago. No one would really know where it is. But it's important to the community because it was the seat of this incredibly famous prayer duel, a prayer challenge, the first of its kind between a man who founded the city, Dr. John Alexander Dowie, and the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the fifth successor is Hazur, so the founder of our community. They engaged in this prayer challenge in which this man created a city to wipe out Islam, created a city to attack Islam in Zion, Illinois. He called it the Zion, the Zion that we understand, right? The Zion, which is this promised city. But he built it as a Christian, faith preacher and healer. And he set up this, you could say, an empire in that area, all on the backs of attacking Islam. And it was the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, who ironically, his community has been declared non-Muslim. It was him who championed and defended Islam for all Muslims, and engaged in this prayer duel that whoever is a liar or a false claimant in the eyes of God would perish before the other. And that's exactly what happened. And this man passed away in a ignoble way, in a humiliating way. And it was done in the lifetime of the Prophet, and it was captured by hundreds of US papers. And we presented all of this, and then, of course, had the opportunity to build a mosque in the very city designed to destroy Islam. And this was known as Fath-e Azim, the grand victory, which was the very words that were, we as Ahmadis believe, revealed to the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And that's the name that Hazur gave to this mosque. And now we had an opportunity to host the fifth successor, the leader of the Ahmadiyya community, for the first time in this brand new mosque in the very city built to eradicate Islam. What a moment. October 2022, and we had an opportunity to host Hazur. This was just last year, a little bit over a year ago. And what a beautiful event. And there's so much that happened in the event. I'll just share one point, and that was the mayor of the city, who knew about this history, himself a Christian, a bit unaware of this history, was hosting this inauguration of the mosque, perhaps reluctant to, engage in this kind of religious history that was over 100 years ago, not understanding it, attended the event along with many other officials, was so overwhelmed with Hazur's address that he said that there was a particular set of electricity, spiritual electricity, he described it, in the room when he was delivering that address, called him a man of God, and gave the key to the city to Hazur, the very key to a city that was set up to eradicate Islam. A historic moment of epic proportions and with such grace that he received this key. And what does Hazur say in a moment of spontaneity? He says, the key to the city is in good hands, is in safe hands now. And there was a beautiful moment that I observed from the podium, moderating that event, and it was just a beautiful historic moment for all Ahmadis worldwide, and that happened last year. So that trip had a lot of blessings, but I thought I would share that one. And those were two incredible moments for me to have observed His Holiness up close, and the blessings on this community.
That was amazing. It was almost like a full circle moment. So the city that was built to eradicate Islam, it sort of ended up being the city where he was being handed the keys, saying that they were in safe hands. So now from here, I mean, we've touched on the persecution against Ahmadis throughout the world. I just want to now bring it on to the persecution that we see today to the innocent Palestinians in Gaza that we're all witnessing. The human rights are being, so many breaches of human rights. There's so many violations that are being taken place. And of course, it's a topic which is near and dear to any Muslim. But of course, for yourself specifically, due to your, the human rights, your experiences with this, your passion for it, what would you say about this, what we're seeing in the world today?
What we're seeing today is a tremendously tragic conflict that is moving rapidly and deteriorating so rapidly that it's plunging the world at the precipice of a World War III. None of that is exaggeration. The conflict in Ukraine, which preceded it, was already in that realm. But to have a situation where, there was an atrocity committed on October 7th, and then for that to then have transpired into an entire war in a region, in a conflict in Gaza, which is, it has created a set of circumstances which we've rarely seen in the world, which is the outright killing of innocent people in the thousands, and particularly children and women as well. And this is today. I mean, it's ironic we're speaking today, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Today is Human Rights Day. 75 years ago, after World War II, the world came together and said, never again, never again. Never again will we allow what happened in the Holocaust, the killing of Jews indiscriminately by Hitler and his regime. We would never allow it. We would set a path forward of Universal Declaration of Human Rights that would prevent this. And then in 1949 and thereafter, of course, we see the 75th anniversary also now. Ironically, it's these days of the Geneva Conventions or the Convention Against the Prevention of Genocide, particularly 75 years, but the Geneva Conventions after that, which created a set of international rules and framework to prevent future atrocities being done in the killing of innocent people, the humane treatment of innocent people, the prevention of killing non-combatants, as we say. So this, of course, is the seminal issue, and there's so much that can be said about it. From me and my vantage point as a lawyer who understands international humanitarian law and what governs, I view this from the lens of the legal conflict. And it is a complex set of factors, but some things are very evident and clear. There are international rules that govern the humane treatment of civilians. And self-defense is allowed. It is part of the United Nations Charter. Israel does have a right to defend itself. The question is of proportionality and method and effect. And here we see that a non-state actor, Hamas, has committed an atrocity. They've committed atrocity on the soil of Israel. That atrocity is itself a war crime. We know, of course, it's an un-Islamic act. That, of course, goes without saying. But it is a war crime as well. And common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions governs this set of rules about how you should avoid attacking innocent civilians, and non-state actors can potentially be bound by this. I mean,
to be very clear about this legal point, and I want to make this point clear, not really talked about much, but even though Hamas is a non-state actor, it is still bound, arguably, by the Geneva Conventions. Why? Because it is a de facto government of a state of Palestine. Now, there's no Palestinian state as we understand it, from like as a separate state, but there is a state of Palestine that is recognized by many countries, and that, of course, we understand to be Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. That's a territory. And the de facto leader or group that's leading or is in position of authority is Hamas. But they are a non-state actor because it's not a state. So the fact that they arguably are operating to represent a territory, and that state of Palestine, which isn't really a state, is a signatory, is a party to the Rome Statute, is bound by the rules of the International Criminal Court. Then, if Hamas has committed that atrocity, they have committed a war crime, arguably, and that should be investigated. And indeed, it is being investigated by the ICC court prosecutor Karim Khan. So that is number one. But so that happened. The question is self-defense. Israel has that self-defense. But now the question is, what are they doing in self-defense? How do you stretch beyond all the realm of imagination this idea of self-defense? And they've done it in a way where they now have made assertions by, for example, the defense minister of the country, by people in armed forces, by people in government, that there is an intent to potentially raze, meaning demolish an entire city, an intent to destroy, an intent to displace, forcibly displace people, but all in the name or the guise of self-defense. So this creates a profound legal problem for the state of Israel, a profound legal problem, one that they must be held accountable for, which is it permissible for them to drop bombs on otherwise civilian targets because they believe those targets are Hamas controlled? And to what extent, whether those are hospitals or places of worship, can they engage in those acts? And how many people must die for that for them to be held accountable? We're now over 20,000 such deaths. And these are people who have nothing to do with Hamas. Now, there could be a few among them who have been killed because they're Hamas commanders. They may be legitimate military targets, but that has been stretched beyond imagination to target by word and deed an innocent population. That is a violation of the Geneva Conventions at minimum. And what we're talking about here, and I was thinking about all of the various, this issue of self-defense and this issue of proportionality collide often in international law. And there's much to think through about that, right? But here we must understand what are the violations afoot. There's fundamental legal obligations that Israel is violating. Number one, it must not use starvation, including the deprivation of food, water, and other essentials for survival of Gaza's civilian population as a weapon of war against Hamas or for any reason. If you do, you violate the Geneva Convention, which Israel is bound by. Because it is why is it bound? That's an important question. Why is Israel bound? It's in the name of self-defense, because it is engaging in a conflict in Gaza, which is a territory recognized by the international community, and the state of Palestine has arguably signed or acceded to the Rome Statute. So the ICC, therefore, even though Israel is not a party to the ICC, remember, Israel and America are not parties to the International Criminal Court. So people ask, who cares what the ICC says? We care because they're committing the atrocities in a territory of a party to the ICC, which is the state of Palestine. That's why we care. That's why it's a crime scene. It's a crime scene. And it must be treated like a crime scene. And that's what's being investigated right now. It must not use starvation as a weapon of war, number one. Number two, it must take every possible step to target only the Hamas militants and their military infrastructure and to minimize civilian casualties. We call this the principle of humanity, distinction, proportionality, and military necessity. These are four distinct principles that are covered legally, and those have consequences, and there's analysis about that. Number three, it must allow for the return of displaced civilians after the conflict. You cannot engage in self-defense and forcibly displace millions of people. And that is what's happening with the North and South displacement of the civilians in Gaza, that they're going from North to South in a manner that's displacing them, arguably wiping them out from the region and potentially having them go to another country or requesting other countries to take them. That is per se forcible displacement. That is a crime. It's not just it's a crime against humanity, and it's a violation of the Geneva Conventions as well. So this is what arguably is at stake here, okay? And the last point I will say, which is a very important point, one that I had just spoken about recently and am writing about as well, which is a very important fundamental human right of self-determination. 75 years ago or so, Sir Zafrullah Khan, who is a member of our community, who's a distinguished jurist, he gave a speech where he predicted what he called the problem of the partition of Palestine. And in that speech, he specifically said that the right of self-determination, what does that mean? Your ability as a people to determine your own future, politically and economically and socially, your ability to have your own identity and nation belongs to every people. And that right of self-determination belongs to the people, the Arabs, who were there in that land. And I'm not getting into the complex discussion of the land partition and everything that's happening right now with the settlers in the West Bank. And arguably those are crimes, very substantial crimes. I'm just now focusing on this right of self-determination, that the Palestinian people have the right to determine their own future. And that future must include a state that's recognized by international law and all of the community of nations. And that must be where this ends, because it has not happened yet satisfactorily. So that is another arguable rights deprivation. So we have war crimes afoot by a non-state actor, Hamas. We have war crimes afoot by potentially the Israeli government for the actions that it's done. These need to be investigated carefully. They need to be examined. But in my humble estimation, not as someone who practices international humanitarian law, but one who studied it academically and otherwise, that this is a major set of atrocities. And we, as the community of nations, our voices for peace must be towards preserving the rule of law, restoring our common sense of humanity, ensuring no collective punishment, proportionality and distinction, ensuring no one is starved, no one is forcibly displaced, and above all, they have the right of self-determination. So that is my assessment of this situation.
I think that's incredibly powerful and very, very interesting, particularly from a legal perspective. This whole issue we know is complicated by a huge background historical element, a cultural element. There's a huge element of security and militarization in that region. But one thing that's interesting is that many of the Western nations recognize Israel as perhaps one of the most democratic states in that region. So surely one would expect that Israel would abide by, or at least make an effort to abide by, the legal framework set up and international law. And many of the points that you've mentioned today, Israel seems to be in violation of that. Is there a solution, kind of from a legal perspective? Just how can Israel better work themselves to act upon that kind of legal framework that we recognize internationally, even if Israel isn't part of the ICC?
So 3 points on that. A very astute question. I have 3 observations. First and foremost, we must differentiate between the government of Israel and the state actors who are currently leading this effort in conflict and the people of Israel, the citizens of Israel.
many of whom do not support the current government's actions. And there are many voices for peace in Israel, Jewish among them, many also here in the United States, who do not believe that this is the right course of action and they must course correct. So the solution to offer restraint on the Israeli government must come from within, with the people of Israel, the good-natured, good-hearted people of Israel who do not stand for this because it's against their own principles of their faith. So that's a very, very important point, number one. Point number two is that part of the reason that a democracy like Israel is not held accountable internationally is the structural deficiencies of the United Nations body. The very body that was formed to say never again, is also a body that is fraught with structural problems of governance, essential problems as to its own composition, the most salient of which is the composition of the Security Council and the ability for one nation of the Security Council, which favors stronger, more powerful countries, to veto actions of the collective. We saw this just the other day.
Yep.
When the United States voted no for a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, even though all of the members of the Security Council were unanimous with the exception of the UK, which abstained for that very vote for a ceasefire. But that one vote prevents there to be any action. And this is frustrating. The Secretary General, Gutierrez as well, who says that there's nothing that he can really do. His hands are tied. Saying all the right things, but unable to do anything about it is not an effective international institution. So the United Nations needs reform to hold accountable all countries equally.
Absolutely.
This must be talked about now because we see the consequences of a lack of reform. And that's what's happening now, which is a lack of accountability, and not just a lack of accountability, an outright attack on the very framework of the United Nations. The United Nations Women's Organization is being attacked and maligned all over the world because somehow they've held up to the rights of the Palestinian women. So we must be mindful of UN reform to structurally fix these deficiencies. And finally, soft power and diplomacy requires there to be a strong, united voice among the Muslim countries. The Arab people must be united. The Muslims of all over the world must be united. Over 1 billion Muslims, 56 Muslim majority countries, fractured, splintered, not united, disagreeing, having different relationships, having different blocs and alliances. This is not in the following of ensuring justice for everyone. So unity is very important among the Muslim nations to stand up against injustice. And once the Muslim nations are united, perhaps they will have better results. We cannot critique Israel alone without critiquing the leadership of Muslim governments. Let's be clear, there is a problem among Muslim governments, and they must rectify their own behavior in order to course correct. So these are some observations about this inability for a quote-unquote democracy to be held accountable.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. And even your last point, His Holiness, the fifth Caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, he's alluded to this more so recently about Muslim nations uniting and having that voice of combined recognition, which can be voiced throughout the world to the international communities. I think today has been an incredible, really inspiring discussion, and it's been really enjoyable for us to learn about your background, your career ambitions, your guidance, and your spirituality, and how faith affects you in your daily life. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Amjad Khan. Please do keep in touch. We'd love to have you on again. And thank you very much, Jazakallah, for joining us.
Oh, it's a privilege to be here. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you for listening to the Al-Hakam Inspire podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Visit our socials on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Al-Hakam Inspire. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave your comments there. We would love to hear your feedback and thoughts, so send us an email to inspire@alhakam.org.